And I'm sure people will come in, but I'm not seeing anybody else in the... Go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Preeti Joshi, and I'm the outgoing, I have actually gone, I'm the outgone VP of RSVP, but I'm just delighted to be moderating, welcoming and moderating this session with Leslie Howsam. I think Leslie doesn't need a lot of introduction, but I will introduce Leslie anyway. Leslie has been an old friend of RSVP for very many years. She has served RSVP in many capacities, including, I want to get this right, including the planning committee, sort of the big vision, coming up with the future of RSVP, but also on the current index. So, the nitty-gritty of work in periodical studies. She has also served as the president of SHARP, the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading, and Publishing. And I don't have the years on when you were president of SHARP, Leslie, in your bio, but...
I think it was 2009 to 13.
Okay, 9 to 13. I mean, Leslie is a complete through and through book historian, and I've learned so much from Leslie about the materiality of texts and book history. So Leslie is currently based in Toronto, where she holds a senior research fellowship at the Centre for Digital Humanities at Toronto Metropolitan University. She is also professor emerita at the University of Windsor in the Department of History. So she brings the historian's eye to what we often tend to be very English-dominated association. I'm just going to read a couple of Leslie's publications. She has published in Victorian Periodicals Review, recently an article in Eliza Orme and the Women's Gazette and Weekly News, and the article is subtitled "Editing the Organ of a Fractious Federation," which nobody would ever call us. But if we have fractious federations, Leslie will be able to tell us how to do that, how to manage that. She has recently published Eliza Orme's Ambitions, and she's going to talk this is not a book launch, but she's going to talk out of that book and raise some questions for us as periodical studies scholars. Just really quickly, I'm sure all of you know these books, but her other books include The Cambridge Companion to the History of the Book, really important book from 2015, passed into print, The Publishing of History in Britain, 1850 to 1950, absolutely marvelous book, 2009, and Old Books and New Histories, and Orientation to Studies in Book and Print Culture from 2006. So I will go quiet now. Leslie will take over. And has a slideshow, and then we'll have Q&A after that. So thank you and welcome, Leslie.
Hello. Should I be sharing? Do you want me to do the slideshow now?
It's entirely up to you. If you would like to start the slideshow now, you can, or if you want to wait.
No, I have it set up so that I'm in it. But I'm not. Now I'm dithering about how to do the slide share, even though you showed me how. So that's going to be inside Zoom, right? I remember now.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, perfect. Yep. It's showing great.
Right. The only thing is I also need on my own screen to see my notes. And now you're seeing my notes too, right?
No, we're not seeing your notes, Leslie.
Okay, perfect. All right. So thank you, Preeti. I should also say congratulations. You're being extremely modest when you call yourself an outgoing vice president when you're actually a president now. So congratulations on that. Thank you also to Fanula for recording. So when the announcement of my open access book on Eliza Orme came out last spring from Open Book Publishers, Preeti asked me if it might be appropriate for an RSVP digital event. There certainly is a periodicals component to the book, but RSVP has already given me a platform to write about Eliza Orme in my VPR article, about her newspaper, the Women's Gazette and Weekly News. And before that at the Brighton Conference in 2019, when I workshopped the paper that became the article. So it might be argued that RSVP has actually heard enough about this person. On the other hand, there's a whole chapter in the book about Eliza Orme's published writing, most of it journalism for various periodicals. And even more intriguing, there's this one thread that I had to leave hanging, the suggestion that she was one of only 3 women who wrote leaders in the late Victorian periodical press. So yes, I think that my research on this and other questions does throw a kind of sidelight on the methodologies of periodical studies and the way it's practiced these days. So I'm going to start by introducing Eliza Orme as quickly as I can manage. If you want to know about how I first discovered her and stayed interested over about 40 years, you're going to have to read the book. What she's best known for is being the first woman in Britain to earn a law degree from University College London in 1888. What happened after that was not straightforward because the legal professions were adamantly patriarchal, and they never admitted women until long after she retired. Instead, she had a kind of unofficial, uncredentialed practice in Chancery Lane Chambers, which is the neighborhood of the courts and law offices, where she worked around the restrictions to use her training and make a living, actually quite a good living. Apart from that, her major passions, at least in public, were women's suffrage and home rule for Ireland. And these translated into a fierce commitment to the Liberal Party and its auxiliary, the Women's Liberal Federation. So she's not known as a journalist, but she did write articles for the Examiner in the 1870s and later for the English Woman's Review, Longman's Magazine, 19th Century, and the Fortnightly Review. Also, she edited a specialized political newspaper for 3 years. And as I said, she's been identified as a leader writer for Major Penny Weekly. One reason I'm talking about her in the context of periodical scholarship is that in RSVP, we're very interested in issues of journalism as a profession, especially for women. The question here is, if a woman couldn't legally practice her first choice of profession, what does it mean that she did a substantial amount of journalism? Eliza Orme was born in 1948 into quite a well-off family living in London in Regent's Park. Father a distiller, mother a patron of the arts, including the Pre-Raphaelites. Again, read the book for the juicy details. She knew a lot of people, including George Eliot, George Gissing, Hertha Ayrton, Harriet Taylor, and John Stuart Mill. In 1872, she wrote to Harriet Taylor, stepdaughter, of course, of John Stuart Mill, stating her ambition to enter the legal profession. Orme was 23 years old and had already been one of the first 9 women to pass the historic first general examination for women at the University of London and gone on to study at University College. Once she was committed to law, she studied political economy and won first prize in 1872. She studied Roman law and later jurisprudence with the legal scholar W.A. Hunter, William Alexander Hunter. Remember that name because you're going to hear it again in a journalism context. Needless to say, there were many obstacles in her way. As I said, the legal profession made it so difficult for women to enter its ranks that nobody did until 1919, after the suffragette movement and the First World War and the passage of the Sex Discrimination Removal Act, all of which was too late for Eliza Orme. Instead, she practiced law within the limitations of that patriarchal system, in chambers in Chancery Lane, discreetly researching and writing the documents to which the great man, the qualified barrister, would put his name, and being paid half the fee he received for a task on which he was accredited and she was not. Also, there were a few roles that were not restricted to barristers and solicitors, so that Orme and her partners also acted as, for example, conveyancers and patent agents. She supported women's suffrage from early on. She did a great deal of public lecturing and also encouraged other women to learn the skills of oratory. The Women's Liberal Federation was founded in 1886, and she edited, as Preeti mentioned, the Women's Gazette and Weekly News for them from 1889 to 92. The paper came to an end amid a rather spectacular breakup of the Federation. Around the same time, she was invited to take charge of the women's work component of the Royal Commission on Labor, which operated in 1892 and 3. Around the same time, her research included working conditions for women in the Black Country metalworking industries and women's work in Ireland. But the assignment that collected the most interest in the press and by historians since then was her report on women employed in bars and pubs. And with all those press reports, my insider RSVP knowledge comes into play in the form of a bit of doggerel from Punch and an attribution via the current index. So here's the poem in Punch to Hebe. And you may know that in Greek mythology, Hebe is bartender to the gods, as it were. And if you know how to use the current index, you can find that this thing was written by one Horace Frank Leicester, himself a barrister. So it begins, waitress with the dimpled chin, cap as clean as a new pin, here's a feather to put in. For Miss Orme's report declares that no male with you compares in the showing off of wares. And it continues with references to not being allowed to sit down and other barmaid grievances, including long hours and sexual harassment. And it ends, gather then the tips that fall, don't let vulgar chaff appall, to the bar you've had your call. I'll leave it to you to imagine her chagrin at the bad pun from a barrister, if she knew who it was, about the bar and the calling of a barmaid. In 1894, Orme got onto a parliamentary committee on the conditions in prisons, reporting, of course, on conditions for women inmates. And after that, not much. Her name turns up in the press a few more times, and I did manage to find a handful of letters she wrote to a friend that helped to fill out the chronology. But in general, she kind of fades out of public view sometime in the early 20th century, even though she lived until 1937. I can't be sure about her private life, but she had a lifelong relationship with Raina Emily Lawrence, another law graduate who worked with her in the Chancery Lane office. And that relationship was certainly intimate, if not sexual. But we're not going to talk about sex, we're going to talk about periodicals. So here we go with the periodicals aspect.
Well, Leslie, can I interrupt for one moment?
Yes.
I want your camera is messed up so that we're not seeing you. There you are.
There I am. Okay, I'm going to have to move. I pushed it down because I wasn't able to see my notes. So I'm going to turn my head a little bit so you can see my notes, but you'll also see me. Sorry about that.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Okay, so anybody who's worked on women in journalism knows that we're quite interested in that subject. And in fact, they were interested in it back then too. In fact, there was an article about it in the Women's Gazette and Weekly News. This particular article we're talking about today, though, I first came across in a book by Barbara Onslow. And many of you will remember Barbara as a loyal and long-standing member of RSVP who died not long ago. So this was in the monthly packet near the end of the run of that well-known magazine for girls, when a new editor was vainly trying to change the focus from Anglican piety to women and work. The author was someone called Fanny L. Green. Now, I haven't been able to find out much about Green. This article was reprinted in an edited book on ladies at work, papers on paid employments for ladies, 1893. And she also wrote stories and articles for the Girls' Own paper, mostly on food and cookery. In the course of talking about women as reporters, editors, sub-editors, compositors, and other roles, Green noted that leader writing is one of the most influential and highly paid branches of newspaper work. but up to the present, women have had but very small share in it. Probably there are very few of their number who possess the thorough training in history, philosophy, economics, and politics, the mature judgment, and the power of clear, concise, and forcible expression that made Harriet Martineau's work in this direction so valuable and successful. And in the ellipse, there's a lengthy aside on Martineau. Miss Power Cobb has written Leaders for the Echo, and Miss Orme has performed the same service for the Weekly Dispatch. Leader writing, however, from the nature of things, cannot be entrusted to anyone whose opinion does not carry weight with it. The leader writer is in no sense a tyro in letters. Now, I was thrilled to discover this snippet. Scholars in RSVP and in Victorian studies generally know a lot about Harriet Martineau. Ian Crawford can probably enlighten us on this, and also about Frances Power Cobb, where the late Sally Mitchell wrote so much. But I think until now, nobody has really heard of Miss Orme, and maybe just as significant, nobody seems to know much about the Weekly Dispatch, at least the Weekly Dispatch in its later years. So it was going to be searching for the proverbial needle in the proverbial haystack, even to find these pieces, which would not, of course, be attributed to her, because leaders never are. Nor was there any suggestion that a marked copy of the Weekly Dispatch had survived in any archive or library. But what I did have was all my other knowledge of Orme, in particular, where she was educated and by whom and what her politics were and how she practiced them. So I looked up the Weekly Dispatch in the DNCJ, Waterloo Directory, and British Newspaper Archive. The first thing I noticed was that one of the many editors was that man I mentioned earlier, W.A. Hunter, a man himself known more for jurisprudence and politicking than for newspaper work. But I knew Orme had written a few entries for the 1898 volume of the Dictionary of National Biography, one of them on Hunter. It was based on personal knowledge that included the fact that, quote, he was for 5 years editor of the Weekly Dispatch. And I knew that Hunter had taught in the law school at University College when she was in his classes and when she was winning prizes for jurisprudence. So that all leads me to infer that if he was with the newspaper for that particular 5-year period, that was probably when she was there too. And in fact, from other bits and pieces, I'm quite certain that Hunter was a lifelong mentor, friend, and colleague. Crucially, they had their Gladstonian radical liberal politics in common. Even so, this dating of her possible leader writing is only a conjecture. The one and only piece that I can even tentatively attribute to Orme is a letter to the editor of the Weekly Dispatch from, quote, a London radical in 1887. The sources seem to think Hunter was editor from 1887 to 92, following H.R. Fox-Bourne and preceding Frank Smith. But the sources themselves are more than a little fuzzy, and if anyone has written recently about the late Victorian phrase of the Weekly Dispatch, I have not come across it. Speaking of fuzzy, sorry about this. This was a very widely circulated newspaper, around 180,000 copies every Sunday in the 1890s. It went back to 1795 originally and was known as Bell's Weekly Dispatch. Thankfully, this has been digitized in the British Newspaper Archive. So in preparation for today's event, I started turning over the digital pages, just skimming and gathering impressions. So the first thing to be said is that the leaders are not leaders in the sense of either Martineau's or Cobb's lengthy and discursive essays on social and moral questions. I'm sorry about the reproduction quality here, but I think you can at least see that the first 3 columns consist of brief paragraphs, which are the leaders, very opinionated statements on current events.
Leslie, could I just pop in here? I think Lorraine,
Yes.
we're not seeing, have you moved your slide? We're still seeing your main slide. We're the title slide. We're not seeing your next slide.
Okay, let me see what I can do for you here.
Yep, if you there, yep, down there. Or maybe if you just hit the enter or return bar on your either of those. Oh,
Okay, screen sharing has stopped. So we're going to have to get back to that. Okay, so if I say okay to screen sharing has stopped and then share again.
yep.
Right.
Yep, we're seeing, okay, so now we're seeing your, so you might,
Right.
did you want to be on the second or third slide? Or you can do it from the beginning and
I'll
then,
start from the beginning and just click
Yeah.
through. So that was the bio bit, and we can return to that in the questions. That was the poem to Hebe and Fanny Green's quote.
Yep.
I'm sorry about this. And the timelines. And now the only thing, okay, here we are. So we're looking at the Weekly Dispatch,
Thank you.
and I'm talking about what the newspaper looks like here. So you can see the first three columns. To me, it raises the question of whether Fanny Green even knew exactly what she was talking about. Is it even legitimate to count these pieces as leaders? So the Weekly Dispatch was emphatically a capital R radical paper, which means that they were associated with the Liberal Party, but placed themselves a little to the left of Gladstone while remaining firmly to the right of socialists. They were vigorous proponents of home rule for Ireland, cause to which Eliza Orme was devoted, as was Hunter. The leaders on page 1 of the Dispatch went under the title Topics of the Day. Topics that recurred included secularism and anti-monarchism, also anti-imperialism, and plenty of liberal politics, including the activities of the Women's Liberal Federation. They opposed cruelty to children and animals, featured coverage of crime and sports. Yes, there was serial fiction, but I'm afraid I haven't spent much time on that, notably by Eve Nesbitt. There was often an allusion to law or legislation, which I suppose might come from either Orme's or Hunter's legal training. The coverage of women's political issues was scant, but quite solidly feminist. Celebrations of academic success in the colleges, of the election of women's poor law guardians, that sort of thing. There was a separate column on women's chit-chat, but even that was quite serious-minded. There's also a long-standing column entitled Waifs and Strays, more or less a gossip column, but political gossip. Snippets of commentary on current events, but more ephemeral than what I think are the leaders. I suppose it's possible that Orme produced this during that period and Fanny Green confused it with leader writing. Anyway, now that the two principles are introduced, the leader and the person and her newspaper, what does this mean as a challenge to periodical studies? So the first place I go as a founding member of the current index committee is attribution studies. The fact that it matters to find out who wrote the anonymous pieces of journalism that appear in the Victorian press. Although even to say the fact that it matters is a bit controversial because, of course, there's also an argument that what really matters is the voice of the periodical itself as a periodical, much more than the individual voices of the people who spoke. And anyway, is attribution studies really designed for tracking down someone as obscure as Eliza Orme, or indeed the man who wrote To Hebe in Punch? Secondly, I haven't said much about it in this presentation, but in the book, I suggest that a young middle-class man with political ambitions might well pursue a degree in law, not so much with practice in mind, but to develop a reputation and make useful connections. Such a young man quite often added occasional journalism to the mix, writing for periodicals associated with their chosen party. So does RSV scholarship have a way to theorize this kind of occasional and almost incidental or opportunistic or careerist writing profile as a kind of journalism? And should we? And then, as a feminist scholar with a career-long interest in the intersection of women's studies and book history, I want to take some time to unpack Fanny Green's statement about leader writers. First, it was no accident that very few women possessed, as she said, very few women possessed the intellectual training she says they required. And despite all the restrictions, it's also true that many women actually did have the necessary judgment and power of expression. It's also interesting that she says that leader writing cannot be entrusted to anyone whose opinion does not carry weight with it. She obviously knew that leaders were published anonymously, so it would seem that the weight of opinion was the weight of the newspaper in question. But at the same time, the actual journalist had to have some weighty training and experience behind them, and that was difficult for women to acquire. However, in a paper like the Weekly Dispatch, what seems to have mattered most for a leader writer was a detailed knowledge of what their own party was doing and the dastardly activities of the other party, whether it was the licensing of music halls or the misbehaviors of royalty and the peerage. And finally, this is an idiosyncratic project, research on a single individual undertaken over a period actually of decades, starting when all the sources were in print form only, ending up depending heavily on digital resources. Just one example of the sort of kind of project it is, in terms of searching the British newspaper archive for Orme, I often came across the same snippet of information in more or less the same words in several different newspapers, like something about a lady winning the prize for jurisprudence or Miss Orme writing a report on barmaids. Now, I know about scissors and paste journalism because I'm a periodical scholar, but a legal scholar, for example, might find herself mystified by this repetition. And there's something singular about Orme's notoriety, in that it doesn't quite fit the world that periodical scholars are usually looking at. It's more commonplace to research a literary figure or a well-known newspaper or a genre of writing that appeared in the periodical press or the press itself. But increasingly nowadays, as we learn to use the digital resources at hand, new questions are arising. What was going on at the Weekly Dispatch? Who were the editors and proprietors of this second tier but widely circulated newspaper? I'm going out on a limb today and claiming to be a periodical scholar, but I'm really more of a book historian. And I'm very conscious there's a lot of things I don't know about how the periodicals work. So I'm keen to hear questions and observations from the audience. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Yeah, you're going to stop the screen.
I think we can stop sharing unless somebody needs to see the quote again, but let's just talk.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Leslie. And yeah, I took notes on that last slide with your challenges. So, but if people need, we can pull it up again. Wonderful. So what we're going to do is Leslie has left us plenty of time to help us think through those questions. Leslie really wanted this to be a conversation where she gets feedback from us. So I'm going to invite folks to either raise their real hands, or if you would like to raise your digital hand, that puts you sort of in the order of things. Go ahead and raise your digital hand. If you feel you would like to turn your camera on, that'd be great. It's nice to see faces to ask your question. If you would like to not put your question in the chat, go ahead and do that. And I will read your question out loud. So as folks are thinking, I'm also going to put in the chat. Leslie, is this a good time for me to put
Sure.
the link to your, okay, so I'm going to put in the chat a link to Leslie's book that just came out on Eliza Orme, which is an open book publication. So you can go and check it out. So
happy to say it's been downloaded more than 300 times, and it's been accessed on Google Book Views a couple of thousand times. So I have no idea, how deeply people are reading it, but it's really one of the nice things about publishing with something like Open Book is that you know exactly how many copies are out there, which you don't always know with an academic press.
I think 300 is more, it's 200 more than mine. Kathy.
That was wonderful, Leslie. I don't really have a question, but I just wanted to take up your point about attribution and the challenge that raises, because it's exactly the same problem that I faced when I was working on the special correspondence. Of course, those pieces were unsigned as well, just from our special correspondent. I suppose and I always worried that part of my anxiety was because I came to this as a literary scholar, so I want to know the author. But it also depends upon what you're wanting to say and what you're wanting to do. So, I mean, if you're wanting to uncover networks behind the periodical itself, then of course it matters to know who it was and, what relationships were at work there. So that's just my 10 cents worth, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Kathy. Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly on the voice, on the side of the people who think that it matters and that there's a point to attribution studies, even though it's so fiendishly difficult. But I think part of what I'm getting at with my idea of this being a challenge is that it kind of points up how difficult all this is, how many people there were who were contributing. And when we look at the kinds of scholarship there is on Victorian periodicals, it's often focusing on what is known, and perfectly reasonably, but how do we get to know what is not known? So thank you for that.
Joanne?
Thank you, Leslie. Can I say I found your entry on Orme in the Oxford DNB very helpful preparation for your talk today. I just wanted to mention 3 sources that came to mind as you were speaking, one of which will be familiar to most people. I think the first is James Fitzjames Stevens' article on journalism in the Cornhill in 1852, in which he talks a great deal about leader writers and says they provide the intellectual mincemeat for busy people who all they need to do is to read leader writers and they'll be up to date. But he also says that there are only about 100 decent leader writers in the country. In other words, this is the elite core of journalists. So the fact that Orme is in that group already distinguishes her, even if you don't know which of the Daily Dispatch's leaders she wrote. The second thing that came to mind was Fox Bourne's History of English Newspapers, in which he grumbles that the problem with being a journalist is you start at the bottom and you work your way up, but it's so easy, he says, for eminent members of other professions to enter at the top and overtake you. And he especially mentions lawyers who are particularly adept at working their way into the profession. So it seems to me that, going back to Kathy's point, does it matter? Well, it does up to a point, but it's also marks Orme out, it seems to me, that she is one of this elite core, and she's very elite because she's one of very few women.
Yes. Well, thank you for that. It's really, it's really wonderful. This is exactly the kind of conversation I was hoping we could have. I know about both Stevenson and Fox-Byrne, but I hadn't read them closely enough, or I hadn't read Fox-Byrne closely enough to pick up that really useful point about the lawyers kind of pushing themselves in ahead of the people who identified themselves as journalists. And I think that goes to a couple of the things I've been saying. You know, in terms of Eliza Orme wanting to be a lawyer, you know, my big point about when I call the book Eliza Orme's Ambitions, my big point is I think she wanted to be a lawyer as a stepping stone to something else, like becoming a member of parliament. Like if they had passed women's suffrage when they should have, then that would have been a reasonable thing for someone of her generation. So then I started thinking, well, other lawyers, other people with law degrees were using their degrees for that, and not necessarily to practice in chancery in their whole lives. So I think that's something that might be worth, you know, worth a bit more research. So thanks very much for that pointer.
Patrick.
Well, I just, this is a little bit of a fanboy comment, but I just wanted to say, what I love about Leslie's Orme book mostly is that it is the way she configures it as a research memoir, quote unquote, so that it is, and that accomplishes a couple of wonderful things. One is that it makes a great story. I mean, how she got to know Orme and how Orme was kind of her white whale for 40 years, you know, her pursuit of Orme here and there, and it's things that we can all as scholars relate to. There are these serendipitous, you know, evidence that just turns up out of nowhere where you go, oh, wait a minute, now finally I know this, but I still don't know that, you know, and so it's, and so it makes a great story, but it also highlights what she's talking about today, and that is there are these, especially when you're dealing with periodicals, there are these gaps. We just don't know. What are we going to do with these issues with attribution where we just don't know? I mean, one thing, as Leslie knows, the current index is now very much in pursuit of Francis Power Cobb's attributions, which are buried in a set of scrapbooks that are in the National Library of Wales. And we're trying to get those all photographed and all of them put in where she pasted all of her leaders for the Echo into these scrapbooks. So that, and for a couple of other magazines too. So we're going to know a lot more. And of course, Sally Mitchell had access to these when she wrote her biography, but there's still a lot more we need to know about leader writing that we're going to learn from that. But I've been racking my brains, and maybe somebody can help me out. But when Mary Shannon, I don't think Mary's here, but when Mary gave her talk about her new book about Billy Waters some weeks ago, she talked about this concept that some historian had brought up that probably everybody knows but me. And it was a phrase about basically using a kind of creative imagining as a historian to kind of paper over the gaps in evidence, which is both exciting and also makes my blood run cold, frankly, because it is, we already have a lot of misattribution that goes on because people feel overconfident about using internal evidence to say, well, I know what Orme sounds like, and this is definitely by Orme, you know, this kind of thing. So you can't do that. But what do you do when you're faced with these gaps? I'm talking too much, but I just want to add one little thing from Eileen Curran. Eileen had a name for this kind of problem. I was talking with Leslie about this before, and she called it yes, but what? She had a whole category of attributions where she had somebody who said, well, you know, so-and-so wrote a lot of articles for Illustrated London News or Fortnightly or whatever. And she listed all these names and she called them her yes, but what? Yes, we know they wrote for that periodical, but what exactly did they write? And that's a whole category that I hope that with more attribution research, we can whittle that down a little bit.
Well, I won't comment on all those things, Patrick, but I do want to talk a little bit about speculation, which historians talk about too. And I was emboldened to speculate, partly because I had the great privilege of knowing Natalie Zeman Davis, who died just very recently. And she, of course, was famous for going a little bit beyond the written evidence to very, very reasonable arguments that have then taken other scholars in even deeper into the cultures that she was talking about. So I think there's speculation and speculation. I do think I said I skimmed around in the newspaper. And whenever I found something that I kind of liked the sound of myself, I was really tempted to, attribute it to Eliza Orme, but I know it does not work that way. And I also know that there's some parts of her life that I know better. Like, I don't really know a lot about the Liberal Party because I don't have any letters. Like I said, that guy Hunter was probably a very close friend, but since there's no letters or any other attribution, I can't really take it very far. So there are probably other cases where if you knew a lot more about what was going on in government and specifically with the Liberals, then you would pick up more. You might say, okay, now I know this is what she's talking about because I recognize it from something that she wrote in a letter to somebody. But I haven't been able to do that, at least so far. Yeah, I'll stop there because there's other hands up.
Jermaine, did you?
Yeah, I said I'd stop because there's other hands up.
Yeah, so go ahead, Jermaine.
Oh, this is a really minor thing, but it might turn into something useful for someone. Do you happen to know if people who wrote for the journals and the newspapers got to attend at the press? Did they get to correct their own writings once they're copied, or was it all just too fast and casual? I think you'll remember that we had a discussion about the little review I wrote of the work that was going on about 20 years ago on Catherine Parr Traill and Susanna Moodie, who were the sisters of Agnes, I forget who wrote The Lives of the Queens of England. She stayed. Sorry?
Agnes Strickland.
Okay, Agnes, they were Stricklands, 3 Strickland sisters. I have not read The Lives of the Queens of England, but there is a surprising in the letters. There's a surprising amount of you must have be paid for so many sheets, and you must get a chance to correct it, and that sort of thing. It's a good place. It's a good problem to think about because attending at the press is something that goes way, way back to the 15th, 16th century. Erasmus, of course, attended to the press. There's an entire life written of him as a person who attended at the press. I sometimes wonder what the personal conflicts that ensued were like. But I just simply wondered if leader writers did attend at the press and if perhaps she did as well.
Well, thank you, Jermaine. That's actually a good question. And there has been a lot of work in Victorian periodical scholarship about this. And I mean, there's people here who know better than I do, but I think generally the answer is sometimes that sometimes there was a presence, sometimes they even had a meeting around a table. Patrick has written about the people gathering around the table for punch and kind of hammering out what the editorial statements were going to be for the week. So yes, they did attend at the press, but I think it also raises the question about about the women. Would it be more likely for a woman to handle it at a distance, or is that, is that an outmoded question? So thanks.
Yes,
Thanks for that.
the days of women bossing printing outfits in the 16th and 17th centuries were far gone.
Stefan?
Hiya. So we talked a lot about, what is a leader writer and how to think through all of this. But hearing you talk this morning, what's having me think about, especially when you were talking about the folks who were opportunistic, they were focused on their career, making occasional contributions. I'm wondering, as we're starting to look beyond journalism in our field towards, typesetters or compositors and all these sorts of things, have we taken the category of journalists for granted? This is what I'm thinking about, right? We were talking about leader writers. I wonder what that conversation would have looked like if we just started talking about journalists, right? Joanne had mentioned, these lawyers who come in at the top of the ladder, right? And the frictions that are there in that category. I'm thinking about the Institute for Journalists, who desperately wanted the dues from the roving reporters and the penny aligners, but in private would not describe them as journalists, right? Or not the right sort of journalist. So I think there's variance in this category. And I'm excited, somebody should write something, much like I think about David Finkelstein's, what do editors do? What do journalists do? I think that there's something with the leader writer specifically within that. So I'll stop and let someone else pick it up.
Well, yeah, I think I want others to comment too, but I think that's useful about a really trivial sort of piece like Vanny Green's, is she's talking about what all the different people who are contributors to journalism are doing. And maybe if we took it at face value and didn't just cherry pick for names in the way that I was, even something as basic as that might be an entry to the kind of thing you're talking about. Because I think if journalism can be occasional, then maybe we should rethink what we mean by a journalist. So thank you, Stefan.
Martin, do you want to pitch it?
Yeah, pretty thanks, and hello to everybody. It's nice to be here. Yeah, I mean, I think my comment was kind of along the lines of Jermaine's comment, in that it seemed to me that the dynamic of the construction and production of the leader was a significant part of the gendering of its production. I think there were challenges in terms of the conversations around what topics should be kind of focused on for the leaders, the timeliness of them, the immediacy of them, which I think made it more difficult, particularly in a daily issue, of course, but I think also in a weekly issue, for leaders to be written at a distance, although that wasn't obviously an entire bar. My sense is, to answer part of the bigger sets of challenges that Leslie was asking, is that, this is an absolutely critical question, isn't it? Because here we get to the heart of the identity of most Victorian newspapers. When we talk about the identity of the paper, we are primarily, I think, talking about the voice of the leader writers as a kind of collective. And so, who wrote the leaders is important. How the leaders were kind of identified and the agendas were created, how they were read and revised, if indeed they were, is also kind of critical. And if we reverse engineer that, those processes are also really important if we want to try and read from the leaders that people write to themselves and their own opinions and their careers, because to an extent, leader writing is ventriloquizing the collective voice of the press, of the title, or at least we would assume that it is. And until we know, and the more we know about those kind of processes, how did the editor, if the editor was not the leader writer, and I think, to take up Stefan's observation, my sense of what was happening in the Morning Star, for example, in the 1860s, was that there was quite a lot of slippage between the identity of editor and the function of editor, and the identity and function of leader writer. A lot of kind of overlap and kind of uncertainty and shifting of roles. Yeah. So I think, this is clearly an area which, speaks to the very heart of how we understand the identity of the press. That's what I would say.
What I really like about what you say is the focus on the identity, leader writing and the identity of the press. And it partly makes me reflect on something I didn't take time to mention, which is really important scholarship of a few years ago by Dallas Little about the leader as a genre. And he was talking especially about the leaders in the Times, and kind of focusing on the leader as a genre of writing. And obviously that's really important. But it also goes right to the kind of difference of approaches in Victorian studies. Martin, you're speaking as a historian. I'm speaking as a historian. We ask somewhat different questions. It doesn't really occur to us to ask the genre question. It occurs to us more to ask the identity question. And as you say, both the identity of the person and the identity of the newspaper in this somewhat nebulous way, but also a way that is always actually connected to real people with real pounds, shillings, and pence, and real influence of a particular kind.
Could I take moderator privilege and come in here, and I want to pick up on a couple of threads. One, what you just mentioned about being a historian, and I actually the difference between being a historian and literary scholar. I'm in an English department, but I think of myself more as a historian. So I want to actually pick up on Stefan's question as a way to come into this. While I think that attribution is really important for all the reasons that Kathy mentioned in her opening comment, but I mean, we all know attribution is really important. One of the things that book history, which I do think has got more historians, but book history as a field has helped me do is actually decenter the author, right? Decenter the author function, right? So not just the author as an individual, but the function. And so Stefan's comment about sort of compositors and punch cutters even, all those different hands that bring us the physical object, right? Seems really not just for the sake of knowing, but because history from below is what, there's an ethical sort of piece to this. So I think for me, what I want to do is think what you're helping us, asking us to do is say, where is attribution, or as we think about attribution and all the things that we like, are we replicating that author function task? Or how can and it's not just because, as Kathy put it, fiendishly difficult to find who an individual is, but who are we not looking for when we try to find the name of whether it's a leader writer or an unsigned piece? So just a big question.
Yeah, but that is a really big question, and I think really goes to the heart of everything I've been trying to talk about today. Where am I going to start? I think that, that distinction, that interdisciplinary question is probably the place. Anybody who's read my old books and new histories, anybody, especially historian friends who've heard me grumble and rant about the disparity in Victorian studies generally. I don't mean just in RSVP, but generally there are so many literary scholars, many of whom, like you, Preeti, consider themselves historians and consider that to really enhance their work, but that there are relatively few who come out of history and ask the kinds of questions that history is asking. And so I think that's where the things that get missed are. I think if we think about attribution not just as a thing about periodicals, but as a thing about people who are writing, and as you say, authorship can mean lots of different things. So all those lawyers who were writing leaders and other kinds of journalism and pushing the other journalists out, they probably didn't even think of themselves as authors, and nor did their friends. So yes, book history has decentered the author, but and perhaps raised the profile of the publisher. But what we really are talking about is the third member of the triumvirate, the reader. So what does the reader think? Is that when the reader is reading the Weekly Dispatch, do they think, oh, this must be a leader from W.A. Hunter or from that Orme person, or do they just attach themselves to the subject matter of the piece? I think that there are so many different ways of approaching this kind of thing, and that it comes down to people's ways of thinking about the past, really. Yeah, so I'll stop there because I see a couple of other hands up.
Patrick, may I let Fionnuala pop in here, and then we'll come back to you if we have time. Thanks, Fionnuala.
Thanks, Preeti, and thanks, Patrick, for letting me go next, because I was just going to follow up on what Leslie said there, which is so interesting, that there is the author, and we can turn the attention to the author. There is the other field, the many other hands in the periodical, like the typesetter or the editor or the publisher. And then you mentioned a third thing, Leslie, which you said is the reader, which is what the historian might be interested in thinking how what the writer is doing and what's in the content of the periodical is interesting to the reader. But the fourth thing, which is a problem for periodical studies, annex relationships to most disciplines, is that it's actually the periodical is the crucial thing. What is the periodical as a genre? What is the periodical as a form, or the periodical as a piece of craft? The periodical as the thing. And the reason why I think I'm trying to work something out in this in relation to Irish literature at the moment, the reason why periodicals remain subjugated knowledge or background is because we don't think about it as form, or it's not considered from a literary scholar's perspective as form at all. And that's what I think is one of the other issues around this.
Well, mostly just to say here, and I totally agree with you. And the only other thing I would add is lately, when I've been talking about book history as authorship, reading, and publishing in the short triumvirate, I almost always add, and it's a material genre. There's the materiality is not really caught up in all of those human factors of writing and reading and publishing. And so I think what you're saying is similar to what I've been thinking in that sense, is that the material genre, never mind the literary genre, the material genre is really a central part of this kind of study and shouldn't be left out.
We have a minute. So Patrick, do you want to go?
Thank you for the minute. I was just going to say, I think one way forward on this, and this takes off partly from what Fionnuala has said about genre and what Martin was saying about the voice of the journal, is one way of going forward on this, I think, is to understand better than we do the relationships between the leader writers and the editorial apparatus of the periodical. And there are a lot of cases, because yes, it's true that many times leader writers were simply voicing the voice of the periodical, but it's also true that they influenced that voice. I mean, Frances Power Cobb wrote all those anti-vivisection leaders for the Echo. Well, the Echo didn't have an official anti-vivisection stance. She created that stance. as a leader writer. And that matters. I mean, Shirley Brooks did essential leader writing in a comic periodical context for Punch. He moved the whole journal to the right politically because of his stance. There was pushback from other people at the table. I think it matters. I think when Tom Mosley was writing leaders for the Times, it mattered if he was writing about the Oxford movement, because that was something that he had particular views about, that he shifted he shifted how the Times spoke. So there were these different kinds of relationships that I think we need to be learning more about, what kinds of relationships, what patterns they had in ones where we do have attribution data, and then try to extrapolate from that to periodicals where we don't have that data.
Sounds like a great place to finish, because you're talking about something that's both theoretical and involves that speculation we were talking about earlier, but also a hard project of research that's going to end up with a complex database that is going to reveal things, and maybe even has ways of reading the digitized press that we haven't accomplished before. So great place to stop there.
Before we thank Leslie, let me just quickly take a moment to tell you all about our next event, which will be the last for 2024. It will be on November 1st, which I just have to say here is one of those incredibly awkward moments, because the UK will have changed their clocks and the US will not have changed their clocks. So the time that is publicized is, I've checked all the clocks and all the times. So, but it's on publishing books and articles, and we will have 2 representatives of Edinburgh University Press who will talk about how to get your idea into a book, or how to get your article into a journal. So you'll see announcements for that, but please let us thank Leslie for really, a genuine conversation. This wasn't sort of, this was actually my ideal, a discussion amongst folks. So thank you very much, Leslie.